Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. This week we're on episode 31 and we have a very, very special guest who we know our listeners from around the world are going to be intrigued to hear what she has to say. Before that, we're going to do our topical witch news roundup. Claire, I believe you have some news from Tanzania that you can share with our listeners.
Yes, I like it's now become a topical witch news roundup.
It's like news round, except from a lot of time ago.
There's going to be some people going, "What's news round?" You do realise that, Zoe?
Okay, well, I'm gonna educate people on what news round was. If you're from the UK, you'll know what news round was, and is, in fact, it still goes. It was a programme for children that told them what was happening in the news. It was great. It's still a great programme, and when I'm in school, I often show it to my younger classes because it gives them a roundup of what's going on. We should see if news round would cover our witches campaign, Claire.
Oh no,
that'd be great.
That's some. Can I just check? John Craven is not any part of the news round anymore, though, is he?
Was John Craven? No, he's not on it anymore. It's all just young people now. They're all very young.
Oh.
They're very young. It's like about 100. They're young folk, barely out of their teens. No, it's young people now. But John Craven? Was he news round for quite a long time?
Yeah, it used to be called John Craven's News. I feel
like
that
the dad. That's maybe before me.
We're significantly getting off-piste to our actual.
We may need to edit this out.
No, leave it.
Okay, right. Anyway, back on topic, Claire. Stop derailing my news mission here. So, Claire, you've got some news about Tanzania, though.
Yeah, well, we were contacted by one of our listeners in Tanzania called Everard, and he's been in contact a number of times to tell us various different things about witchcraft in his area and also keeping us abreast of the news. And this particular piece of news is that the UK National Archive has a 3-part podcast just being put down at the moment about trials in the UK. It doesn't just cover the witchcraft trials, but the links to it, which we will post, are about witchcraft trials in the 17th century. So there's some really interesting information there about the confessions that were taken from people, how they were taken. There's in fact a warning on it saying, you know, if you don't want to know about people being tortured, don't read this. But so you can see that at the UK National Archive, and also you can download their 3-part podcast on trials, which includes witchcraft trials from the 17th century.
That's great. No, it's interesting because obviously, we're not the only podcast that does or has done stuff about witches. It's interesting to see different people's take on the information. And also people that have got a bigger budget than us have maybe got more access to things.
I think the UK National Archives has slightly more access to things like archives
That's true.
than we do. So they've also gathered together papers so you can actually see digitally what's been written out in relation to these 17th century trials. So it's fascinating to read. I actually find it really, really difficult to read because of the handwriting, but apparently if you get into the way of the handwriting, it can be decoded pretty quickly.
Hang on a minute. Do you mean to tell me that as a QC, you're not writing on parchment with like a feathery quill in that similar style?
Oh, yes, of course I am. Sorry.
God, ruining all my illusions of everything.
Hiding my big biro behind my back.
Pens in your wig. Yeah. Anyway, okay, well, that's good. And I think also it's a very useful resource because obviously a lot of people that are listening to this are very keen researchers. So I think anything where people can then go and delve in deeper and find out about their own area, or potentially if they've got an idea that they might be in some way related, then that'll be another fantastic resource. So that's brilliant. And speaking of resources, she said seamlessly, segging in. Did you like that? It's quite fresh though, wasn't it?
I did.
We've had information from, or an email from the Scottish Government to say that the info about the petitions, they've sort of organised them basically. So the links, if you're trying to follow them, the ones that we were using before to get to our petition and all the other petitions are now broken. So we'll put up new links for that. Now, you can no longer obviously sign the petition, and we have had some people asking us where they can sign, but that's now obviously closed. That stage of the campaign is done, but you can go back and have a look, and you can look at, things like the government's response to it and that sort of thing. And I presume that updates will then occur there. So we'll put the links up for people for that one. Just to remind you that our campaign still is very much live, and we're still beavering away on the different things that we're doing. So it is really important that you keep abreast of developments, because we may call on you again to help us with making our voices heard. So that, I think, is that our topical news roundup for this week?
Yes, if you can think of as metaphorically shuffling the papers like the people at the end of the news.
That's very good. That's good.
What we're doing there.
So our guest today is very exciting, because it's the thing I think that when we talk to anybody about witch trials or about witches more generally, that this area, this location is the one that people immediately hone in on. And that is the area of Salem, Massachusetts. So our guest today is going to be fantastic. So in preparation for that, we thought what we'd do today, instead of our usual remembrance for Scottish witches, we thought we would read out the names of the Salem people, if that's okay with you, listeners. So I've got here, it's just going to be a big list of names because we're going to go into the story in more detail during the guest appearance. So the people that were executed by hanging were Bridget Bishop, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, Martha Corey, Mary Eastie, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, George Jacobs Sr., Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Alice Parker, Mary Eyre Parker, John Proctor, Anne Pediter, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell, Sarah Wilds, and John Willard. Giles Corey was pressed to death, so he wasn't hanged. And in prison, one person was born, that was Mercy, who was the child of Sarah Good and John Proctor III. And then also there were some people who died in prison. So those who died in prison were John Durrant, Lydia Dustin, Anne Foster, Mercy, who was the baby of Sarah Good, unfortunately also died in prison, Sarah Osborne, the infant child of Elizabeth Scargan, and Roger Toothaker. Some people also escaped or fled, and I'm going to read their names out because obviously, as we've talked about before, people's lives were ruined, and even if they survived, they might have been banished. So they were John Alden, Daniel Andrew, Mary Bradbury, Elizabeth Carey, Philip and Mary English, Edward Farrington, Mary Green, George Jacobs Jr., and Ephraim Stevens. So that's the names of the people that were executed or that died in prison or that escaped or otherwise fled from Salem.
And without further ado, we'd love to introduce you to Rachel Christ. She is curator and also educator at the Salem Witch Museum in Salem, Massachusetts.
I am delighted today to introduce our guest, who is from a place that everybody immediately thinks of when we talk about our topic. So I'm going to introduce you to Rachel Christ, who is the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Thanks very much for joining us. We're delighted to be able to talk to you about your experience of the witchcraft trials, which are very, very different from the ones we have over in Scotland. Can you tell us, first of all, about your job? What is it that you do?
Sure. So my official title is Director of Education, but I wear many different hats. So as is the case often for small museums, I do a lot of different tasks day to day. So I work with students and teachers. This year, I've been doing virtual classrooms. So that's been one of our pivots for the pandemic. I've been doing Zooms into classrooms across the country, and I've actually had a couple of international Zooms, which have been fun. So we've been doing a lot of...
Can I get you to do my class?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Honestly.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, we can totally do it. Yeah,
I'll come back on that, Rachel.
That's perfect. It's been really fun. Obviously this has been such a challenging year, but some of the silver linings have been we've had to adapt to, different kinds of technology we weren't necessarily using before. So I'm having a great time meeting students and teachers from all over the country, and I've been doing international classrooms as well. So that's been really fun. But in a non-pandemic world, I do many other things. I do all of our social media and kind of social media outreach. I do a lot of our event planning. We recently, this past month, did an event about race and the Salem witch trials. Jill Christensen, who's our assistant education director, and myself spent several months really diving into that topic and did a whole presentation on it, which is actually recorded and free on YouTube if anybody wants to watch it. So, and then we also coordinate with other guest speakers to come in and do events. And another silver lining of the pandemic is we're doing virtual events now, which we had never done in the past, which has really just broadened our audience. And then, day to day, again, in a non-pandemic world, I train our staff to give tours. So I do a lot of training specifically over the summer to get our staff ready to talk about this very kind of complex, dense history. And I also do a lot of curation work. So we recently updated our exhibit, Witches Evolving Perceptions. And I was the one who wrote that interpretive content update and so on. And I could keep going. It's a lot of different tasks, but it's definitely never boring. And it's a really just absolutely fascinating subject matter.
And did you have the interest in the subject matter before you became involved in the job? Or did you get the job and then become involved in the subject matter?
So I always really loved pop culture witchcraft. So, I was very much raised with Harry Potter and Wicked and, these kind of different fictional witches. So, there are Halloween costumes of me dressed up like a witch for years, which is kind of funny now. But historically, I didn't know anything about the witch trials. I didn't really know anything about the Salem witch trials until I was in college working on my undergraduate degree. I was a history major and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it. And I knew I loved gender history, but I needed to figure out a way to make money, find a profession where I could use that. So I had applied to just a bunch of museums in Massachusetts and ended up being hired by the Salem Witch Museum. And I just fell in love with the subject, as I think so many of us do. And now I'm, 6 years in working here, 7 years, 6 years, something like that. And it's an infatuation that I think will last me a lifetime.
It's an enviable and fascinating job you must have. What we see about Salem and when we see it on the internet and stuff like that is it's not only the museum, but the actual place itself is still steeped in the history, the buildings, the streets, the names of places. That must be like living in a museum, the whole area.
Yeah, Salem's an amazing place to live. Salem is so interesting because there's so many layers to the history. So the witch trials are a very, very small period in Salem's larger history. Salem has so many firsts. There's just, you kind of throw a rock and you hit something historical in Salem. And Salem has this really amazing history of the maritime trade. So there's a history of piracy connected to Salem. The Industrial Revolution has a huge impact in Salem. It's just, you can just keep going and going and going. And the witchcraft stuff is fascinating, but it's really just a small portion of what Salem has to offer historically.
On that very, very point, can you, for the Witches of Scotland listeners, tell us briefly about the Salem witch trials? Because I know with your knowledge on it, we could probably have you back for 5 weeks in a row telling us about it. But if you can explain to us briefly what happened in Salem.
Sure. So the Salem witch trials are really interesting because in many ways they're the exception to all the rules in terms of colonial American witch trials. So witch trials had happened in the English colonies before Salem, but they had not been as extreme or as intense. And there really are few witch trials after Salem Really no executions after 1692. This is like the last gasp of a different mentality, a different kind of society in some ways. So when you see witch trials before Salem, you see one person being executed, maybe as many as 5 or 6, but it was rare and it wasn't particularly extreme, especially if we compare ourselves to a place like Scotland that had enormous witch trials. However, Salem, as I said, really just breaks all the rules. And that's why the word Salem is what we hear when we're talking about American witch trials, as opposed to Hartford, Connecticut, which also had a pretty serious witch trial a couple decades before Salem. But you never hear Hartford, you always hear Salem. And it's because Salem is just such a strange series of events. So essentially what happens is in January of 1692, the daughter and the niece of the minister in Salem village become ill with this strange and mysterious sickness. So these girls are falling to the ground, they're clutching their heads, they're making animal sounds, they're having what we might almost consider to be seizures. And it's really frightening to the adults in their lives. These are young kids, 11 years old and 9 years old. So after a month goes by, they've tried all the usual remedies. They try praying and fasting. They call in a doctor. The doctor looks at the girls and says, I don't have a medical explanation for this behavior. However, it could be the effects of bewitchment. So in the 17th century, everybody believes in the devil. Everybody believes in witchcraft. This was just something that could happen at any time. So when the doctor says witches are the ones hurting these girls, everyone kind of goes, yep, all right, that makes sense. So with bewitchment being the case, that means you now need to find the witch. So they essentially ask the girls, who is hurting you? Do you know who the witch is? And they come up with 3 names. So those names are Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. And these are kind of the usual cast of characters you would see targeted during a witch trial. These are 3 women who are social outcasts. They don't quite fit in. Sarah Good is a beggar who was known to be kind of cantankerous. You know, she'd go house to house begging, and if you didn't give her as much as she felt she deserved, she'd yell at you, she'd swear, she'd mutter under her breath, all things that a Puritan woman is not supposed to be doing. Sarah Osborne is a woman who had married beneath her station. She'd married one of her servants, and she also hadn't been to church for some time because she'd been ill, which again is very concerning in a Puritan society. And then Tituba was a slave. So we don't know exactly where she's from, but we know she's a woman of color. So right off the bat, she's as low as you can be in the Puritan social strata. So these 3 women were kind of the obvious choices for people who are consorting with the devil. So they bring them in, they have an examination. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne say, I have no idea what you're talking about. I am not a witch. But Tituba confesses. She says, yes, I'm a witch. You've got me. And there are other witches in Salem. Tituba probably confesses because she knows nobody's coming to her defense. She was, again, a slave. Nobody was going to stand up in court and really, defend her innocence. She also may have been beaten before her trial. But either way, this is really what triggers the witch trial, as now it's not just one witch, there are other witches in the community, and they have to find them. So things really start to spiral out of control pretty quickly. Suddenly, anybody you've had a problem with, you've had a dispute with over borders, territory, I think you stole something from me 20 years ago, or people who have done something socially taboo, like yell at their husbands, publicly, have an argument or something scandalous, so on. These are the people who really start to get targeted during the witch trials. And things really start to spiral out of control pretty quickly. The other big thing to keep in mind here is Massachusetts Bay Colony had lost their charter in 1684, which meant that they didn't know what their legal system was going to look like. They're waiting for their new charter to tell them how their courts are going to operate and who their elected officials are going to be, but they don't have it until May of 1692. So finally the charter arrives, they get it, but now there's literally dozens and dozens of people in jail awaiting trial. So they have to set up an emergency court to deal with these witchcraft suspects. And because it'll take some time to implement the charter, they basically create something called the court of oyer and terminer, which means to hear and to determine, which is an emergency court. Now, because it's an emergency court, they're allowed to do things that they normally would not have been allowed to do. So basically, they can accept evidence that would never have been allowed in an English court before this. It's never allowed again after this. And basically, it becomes impossible to defend yourself against a witchcraft accusation because the evidence that they're using is things like looking up into the rafters and saying, I see the specter of Rebecca Nurse. You can't see her, but I can. And that's how I know she's a witch. And that was enough evidence to convict you for witchcraft during the Salem witch trials.
What is the logic on that then? If you are saying, I can see the spectre of a witch, but none of you can see what I can see, is that person not kind of saying that they are also a bit witchy if they can see something that nobody else can see?
So it didn't make sense even in the 17th century. This was really controversial. There's debates right off the bat at the beginning of that year about how maybe we shouldn't be using spectral evidence. There's not a lot of basis for this. This is kind of sketchy. Like there's letters being written by ministers pretty early on saying, we respect the court. We respect you as gentlemen of Salem, but maybe don't use this spectral evidence. And for whatever reason, they go against that recommendation and they use it. And people are mad. People are saying, I can't defend myself against spectral evidence. What are you doing? And before this time, it was actually really hard to convict someone for witchcraft in colonial New England. You needed a lot of evidence to bring someone through the court and get a guilty verdict, which is why witch trials had been pretty tame in England and its colonies. So yeah, it really leads to things spiraling out of control very quickly. And there's grumbling about it the whole time. However, they push forward and there are ultimately 4 dates of execution. 19 people are hanged and 1 man is pressed to death, which is essentially a form of medieval torture that is really, again, a symptom of how extreme Salem had become. This kind of torture had never been used in the colonies before. It's never used again after this. It's very much a symptom of how intense the witch trials had become because there's these 2 kind of camps of the magistrates who are digging their heels in and saying, we're doing what's best in the interest of the colony. There are witches around and we have to find them. And then on the other hand, you have this growing body of people who are saying, okay, maybe there are witches, but you're executing people who are not witches. You're executing them on false evidence. So all of this has basically gotten to a point in October where the governor realizes they can't go on like this. So the governor of Massachusetts, whose wife had recently been named as a witch. So basically, she's never, brought in for trial. She's never arrested, but one of the afflicted names her based on this spectral evidence. And that's enough for the governor to say, okay, I know my wife is not a witch. So if she can be named by spectral evidence, that means maybe other innocent people have been named too. We got to reconsider this. So he disbands the court of oyer and terminer. Months more go by, though, because now they need to really set up the formal court that's in line with the trial or with the charter. A new court finally reconvenes in January of 1693. So keep in mind, people have now been in jail through an entire summer and winter. We get to January, the court convenes, which is the Massachusetts Supreme Court of Judicature, which is actually the same Supreme Court we use in Massachusetts today. So the first trials that court saw were witchcraft trials, which is super interesting. So they reconsider the cases, but the difference is this court no longer allows spectral evidence. So without spectral evidence, you really don't have a case for any of these people. And ultimately, most people are considered innocent, receive innocent verdicts. There's a couple of people whose guilty verdict stands, but the governor then steps in, issues reprieves for all of them and says, you know what? You're all innocent. This is done. This is over. And slowly the jails start to empty. Although you actually couldn't leave jail until you had paid your bill, because while you were in jail, you were charged for your chains, you were charged for the food you consumed, you were charged for any clothing you took from the warden. So several people went deeply into debt in jail during this time, and at least one person dies in jail after having been declared innocent, but her family couldn't come up with the money for her bill. That's the Salem witch trials in 10 minutes or less.
First of all, thank you so much. That is an absolute whistle-stop tour through the Salem witch trials. I had heard of spectral evidence. I'd also heard, and please let me know if this is wrong, that there was evidence that people could be in two places at the one time. They could give the impression that they were lying in their bed asleep when they were actually attending a coven meeting or something like that. And so people could actually have witnesses to say, we know that person was in her house and we know that person was in her bed, we saw it, but that still wasn't enough evidence because the proof was that that person could be in two places at once, and that was the proof of the devil working.
Yeah, so that's basically the logic of spectral evidence. Like the whole idea of spectral evidence is a witch is capable of projecting out this ghostly form of themselves that can then cause harm, material harm to people at great distances from them. So again, this was controversial. It's not like everyone was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. These were reasonable, rational people, but the fear was just so intense during this period. And this is a whole separate conversation, but there's just a lot of stuff going on in Massachusetts during this period that's causing enormous waves of fear. There's wars going on with the indigenous inhabitants that are causing really bloody casualties on both sides of the conflict. They've lost the charter. There's fights going on about borders and territories. There's something called the Little Ice Age going on. There's really cold winter. So it's just this perfect storm of events that's reached an edge in January of 1692. So when people say witches, everyone kind of naturally jumps on and says, well, that's why things have been so bad for this long. We got to find the witches and we found the problem and things are going to go back to normal. And of course, that's not what happens, but that's the logic of the time.
It's so common. We've spoken now and are speaking to people all over the world, and it's just the same story every time. It's so incredible that different cultures and different places are all like, things are really bad. We've got to find somebody to blame. And if we blame them and we deal with them, things will get better for us. It's just a story that keeps repeating over and over again.
We, in fact, just interviewed somebody who is an advocate for people that have been accused of witchcraft in African countries. And, as recently as I think it was 2 days ago that he broke the story about a 6-year-old girl that's been thrown out of school and therefore just out of education altogether because she's been accused of being a witch. And I think that he'd been saying to us that in sort of the time of COVID, that there's people that are looking for somebody to blame and scapegoat for that. And there's been an increase again with witchcraft accusations because of that. So it's amazing. Here we are in 2021 and it's the same sort of unpleasant side of human psychology. It's bizarre.
Yeah, so we end our museum with the last thing our visitors see, we call a witch hunt wall. And it's a formula we use to break down historic witch hunts and also contemporary examples. So the formula is fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat. And obviously in Salem, that works out very nicely. We have fear of, all of these things that are going wrong, and then fear of the devil. And that's triggered by the outbreak of illness in Samuel Parris's home. And that leads to a scapegoat where 150 innocent people are accused of witchcraft. But we provide 3 other additional examples of how we can see that playing out in a modern sense. Mm-hmm. So the examples we present are the fear of Japanese Americans in the United States during World War II that leads to forced Japanese internment. We talk about the McCarthy hearings and blacklists during the Cold War, which is probably the most famous contemporary example associated with witchcraft or the witch trials because Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. And then we also talk about the scapegoating of the gay community during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, when AIDS was referred to as a gay disease and gay cancer and so on. And those are just 3 examples. We stop in the 1980s, but there's obviously considerably more contemporary examples. And since 2017, we've created an interactive component of this exhibit to get people thinking about how this relates to our lives today. So if you go to our website, which is salemwitchmuseum.com, under the history and education drop-down menu, an extension of our exhibit, which is about witch hunts. And you can submit an example you think fits that formula. And so we've been collecting this information since 2017. We collect it on postcards and online. And it's been really interesting to see how people interact with this term today, how people interact with the formula. Some people really understand it, really get it. A scapegoat is a group of people who are innocent, who are assigned blame during a time of great fear. Some people, though, take it in a very different direction and really kind of don't get it. But as long as people are writing in and thinking about the formula, that's the important part.
It's interesting the way that the word, and Claire and I've talked about this in previous episodes, it's interesting the way that the word witch hunt is used now. And it's quite often, I've noticed, I've not done any sort of academic study on this. This is just purely anecdotal and through social media. But it's amazing now how witch hunt is often used by male politicians when ordinary people, voters, shall we call them, are unhappy with them doing rubbish things. So then, they're like, be responsible, be answerable. And then the male politician says, it's a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt. It's, and you know what I'm referring to here, but I'll not open up that entire can of worms just now. But we're having a similar situation just now, which I think is actually quite relevant and is on point with what you're saying, which is that we've got a situation just now with the leader of Scotland, who is referred constantly by people that don't like her as a witch. She's constantly called a witch. And I think it's partly because it's really, really easy shorthand. It's mostly because of that, because we've all got this connotation of what a witch is in a really negative way. And also because witch is so close to the word bitch, but it's not offensive in the same way that bitch is. It's not as obviously misogynistic. But I would argue it is just as misogynistic.
Which is strange because the word bitch in the modern day carries more offence than the word witch. And the word witch means, against the background of calling a woman witch, is like, you're a witch, and by the way, 400 years ago, we used to burn you.
Yeah.
It's strange.
That's seen as being more socially acceptable to say.
Yeah. Well, so coming from an academic background, I can tell you that is 100% correct. You could easily write a dissertation on that topic specifically.
Come on, Claire, we should get PhDs next.
You've got a topic should you want to. But no, you're 100% correct. We saw the same thing during the presidential election in 2017. Hillary Clinton was called a witch all the time. The words used to describe her were very resonant of a witch. They would say she cackled, things like that. There were memes
coven.
Of her. Coven.
The idea of coven, when any women get together with any other women politicians, it's a coven. It's amazing. It's so lazy. It's just so intellectually lazy. And it just makes me feel the rage. It just makes me feel so ragey that if I could shoot laser beams out of my eyes, there'd be so much of the world that would just be smoking ruins at the moment.
Also, you would actually be a witch if you could do that. So
one day I may have that power. I don't know.
I'm now slightly concerned where this podcast is going. No,
it's okay. Don't worry. I'm not going to kill it.
It'll be a side podcast about that specific topic. But
people that I have lasered to death this week. I won't have any time to record the podcast. I'm too busy.
Rachel, you've been following the Witches of Scotland and our campaign to try and get a pardon, an apology and a national monument. And I know from what I've seen from your social media that of the 19, most of them received formal recognition that they had suffered a miscarriage of justice. Can you tell us a wee bit about how it came about and what has happened for those people? What recognition have they received?
Sure. So this is actually a very interesting process because it really began as soon as the witch trials were over. So again, Salem's really coming in on the edge of legal witch trials. Witch trials really come to an end, you can say, definitively about 1750, but they're really pitter-pattering out by the time we get to the early 1700s. And especially in colonial America, there's a lot of skepticism about how you can prove someone's a witch. So everybody believes in witchcraft, everybody believes in the devil, but because we're starting to see the advent of the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, people are really starting to debate how you can bring someone into a courtroom and definitively prove they're a witch. So that's really happening in the background of the Salem witch trials. And then during the Salem witch trials, things absolutely spiral out of control to a degree no one had experienced before. So in the immediate aftermath, there is considerable public awareness that something had gone wrong and there had been a miscarriage of justice. And you see that in the primary sources really right away. And the government really digs its heels in and says, no, we did what we had to do because there really was a threat of witches and it was a public safety hazard, but maybe we did accidentally accuse some people who were innocent. There's even that little bit of acknowledgement. They won't acknowledge that people who were executed were innocent, but they do say maybe some people were arrested who shouldn't have been. So the fact that that can be stated right away really shows the environment that we're coming into in 1693. But then as the 17th century comes to an end, you start to see demands by survivors for a more formal acknowledgement of their innocence. So the first person to come forward is Elizabeth Proctor, who's the wife of John Proctor, who's executed. And she had been pregnant in 1692, which is why she is saved from hanging. They delay her execution until after she's given birth. And by the time she's given birth, the witch trials have come to an end. But she comes to the court in the late 17th century and says, I'm still seen to be dead in the eyes of the law. I need help. I can't. She's in the middle of a fight with her husband's children, so her stepkids, about the terms of his will. And she basically is getting nowhere because she's still seen to be dead in the eyes of the law. And she goes to the court and says, you need to do something about this. I can't live like this.
Did you say she's dead in the eyes of the law? What do you mean dead? You mean formally not recognized as a person anymore?
So that's how she describes it. That's her language from the petition. So this is where the legal system of the 17th century gets really complicated. To the best of my understanding, so she's issued a reprieve, but because she had been convicted, she's still on the books as a witch. And for others who had been convicted, they basically need this extra step that really clears them of all charges formally. So the next person to come forward who petitions the government, she says the fact that this is still lingering in her record means she's susceptible to being accused of witchcraft again. And she needs the government to make a formal declaration that says, we were wrong, you were never a witch, this, is a miscarriage of justice, and so on. So it's very complicated. We've actually spent a lot of time talking about this recently, and specifically the legal system of the 17th century. But to the best of my understanding, that's what she means. So this then starts to stir up more and more relatives. So by the time we get to the early 1700s, people are regularly petitioning the court saying, you need to do something about this. My relatives, my sister, my daughter, my neighbor, they were erroneously accused of witchcraft and you need to recognize them in some way. So some people are petitioning for reparations payments. They say, this is the money that I spent dealing with the witchcraft trials and you need to do something about it. They finally get some amount of reparations and some names are cleared in 1711. But it's really only the people whose families are around nagging the court for it. So people who had been issuing those petitions asking for recognition. For the remainder of the 18th century, there's petitions going into the court still, right up until the eve of the American Revolution. People are petitioning the court who are now children and grandchildren of those accused during the Salem witch trials saying, you have to do something more, whatever it is, reparation payments, formal acknowledgments, so on. And it all kind of gets set aside in the late 18th century for various reasons, but essentially the American Revolution is the thing that really starts to sweep it to the side. And from that point on, it all kind of settles until we get to the mid 20th century. So in the 1950s, descendants of Anne Putiator, who is one of the women executed in 1692, they come forward and they say, Our great-great-great-grandmother never received the formal recognition of her innocence that she deserves. And you need to do something about this. And they fight with the court. And eventually, in 1957, the court comes up with a declaration that says Anne Pudiator and certain other persons are cleared of all charges. But because they didn't actually name the other people who were executed or, whose names had yet to be cleared, they're still, waiting in this limbo land. And it takes until 2001 for every single person to formally be named. And that happens on October 31st, 2001. The last batch of people are finally declared innocent of all charges. So it's a long process, but it is ongoing. There is actually one person whose name was never formally cleared. Her name is Elizabeth Johnson, and she kind of just gets missed in the records. And it was only recently that somebody realized her name had never been included. And so there's legislator going through right now that's trying to have her name cleared of all charges. And we actually got a message earlier this week that it looks like it's going forward finally.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. So the last person to be formally pardoned will probably be pardoned in 2021.
That's the hope. That's what it seems like. Obviously, COVID has slowed things down considerably, but it sounds like it's starting to go forward again. So that's very exciting.
What was her name?
Elizabeth Johnson Jr.
And how was the Johnston spelled?
Johnsson.
Because my maiden name's Johnston, but it's mine's spelled with a T. Mind you, that far back, because we've already discussed before about names. Yeah, I'm just going to hold on to that. Maybe there's a link there.
Yep, it's always possible.
They play very fast and loose with the spelling back then. There was just
that they did. Yep, very much so.
Yeah, that's true. It starts off a document speaking of Jonet, and by the end of it, it's spelt Jonet in a different way. Yep. She's become Janet or something.
Yep. You see that in the court documents with Tituba. Her name is spelled so many different ways in the documents, and it's just people were spelling it as they heard it is the thought.
So the pardons were given, but also there was, as I understand it, a memorial in Salem as well. What's the memorial?
So in the 1990s, which was the 300th anniversary of the Salem witch trials, for the tercentenary, the city really came together to really put more emphasis on the Salem witch trials. It's very interesting. Throughout the 20th century, there really wasn't a lot about the witch trials in Salem. If you wanted to come and learn about what happened in 1692, you really had to go to the Essex Institute and look at the primary source documents. So our museum is actually the first museum that was founded that teaches the story of the Salem witch trials to the general public. We were founded in 1972, but it took until 1972 for a museum devoted to Salem to exist, or to the Salem witch trials, I should say. And then slowly there's more and more interest. And by the time we get to the 1990s, there's really emphasis again on the Salem witch trials. So the tercentenary was a huge celebration is the wrong word, but a huge ceremony. So there was a contest for the memorial, which is located in the middle of downtown Salem. Arthur Miller came to reveal the winner of the memorial contest. Elie Wiesel, who is the Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, came and gave a speech at the unveiling of the memorial. It was really an amazing affair, I'm told. I wasn't there. Our current executive director was very involved in the tercentenary, as was our previous executive director and previous education director. So our museum was really in it during the tercentenary. The memorial is really beautiful. It adjoins the Old Burying Point Cemetery, which is one of the oldest cemeteries in America. And some individuals, not many, but a couple, including a judge who were involved in the Salem witch trials, are buried there. None of the accused witches, but some people with connections to it. So the idea was that's a very poignant place to put a memorial. And then in 2017, another memorial was erected in Salem at Proctor's Ledge, which is where the hangings took place. So we actually didn't know with certainty where the hangings took place until very recently. There had been speculation for a long time that it was this area of Salem that's known as Gallows Hill. So the popular lore says it took place at the summit of Gallows Hill. A historian had come forward in the early 20th century and said, perhaps it took place on Proctor's Ledge, which is a little bit further down on this. It's the same hill, but it's just a lower ledge. And he kind of gets ignored for whatever reason. He gets swept to the side. And then Marilyn Roach, who's one of the leading historians of the Salem witch trials today, kind of rediscovers this in the 21st century. And she basically, along with a group of other historians, came together and confirmed that Proctor's Ledge would have been where the hangings took place. So in 2017, a memorial was placed there, which stands today.
How do the memorials look? What are they?
So the memorial in downtown Salem is a square, essentially, and in the front of the memorial on the ground are the last words of some of the victims that are cut off on either side, which is supposed to represent how, these people were silenced, essentially. And then there are these stone benches that jut out around the perimeter of the rectangle, I guess is the shape, with the name and the execution date of the 20 people who were executed, including Giles Corey. So the idea is the benches are there for you to sit and quietly reflect on the memorial. People also frequently leave flowers and things like that, sometimes handwritten notes there. And then the Proctor's Ledge Memorial, which has the names of the 19 people who were hanged, is similar in that it's this beautiful stone memorial. It's an arc. It has the names of each of the 19, and a tree was planted there as well. Proctor's Ledge is kind of awkward because it's in the middle of a residential area, because we didn't know that's where the hangings were. So it's actually kind of hard to get to parking wise, and it's not a very big memorial, but it was really important to everyone that something was erected there to, really commemorate the spot.
I'm so glad, though, that they've decided to do it in any event. What do you think of our campaign? What do you think of trying to get in a pardon and a memorial for the Witches of Scotland?
I think it's amazing. Again, when you hear witch trials, you so often hear Salem. And the Salem witch trials are very important, but the Salem witch trials are a tiny, tiny blip in the history of witchcraft. It's really surprising how there's a lack of historical interpretation of these events. There's a lack of memorials, really across Europe. There are some places, some museums and things, but it just doesn't seem like it's memorialized the way it should be, which is really fascinating. So, and especially in an area like Scotland where so many people were executed and it was so much more violent than Salem, there should be memorials, I would think, all over the place. The names should be recognized, but there should be museums. This is really something that it's a story that's so relevant to us today. This is something that is fascinating and also very much important for us to learn about now. So I think that the work you're doing is amazing. I was so excited to see the petition, and I did sign the petition also. I don't know if as an American my name counts, but
yeah, no, it did. It definitely did. We had a good amount of international signers. I mean, the majority were absolutely Scottish, but I think it helps for the government to see that the eyes of the world are watching as well. I think that's really helpful. But we also think it's really important that the rest of the world also sees that we are talking about modern day issues with witch trials and witch accusations, and that, that internationally we work together to make these things stop, and to have people, like you're saying with your interactive wall, about people thinking about, well, why do these things happen, and actually interrogate the impulse that we have, and, to not go there, to not blame other people for misfortunes.
Yep, absolutely. It's so important. It's so relevant, especially because when people hear the word witch, they often think, well, like, okay, we don't believe in witches anymore. This isn't, this is a time when people were barbaric and gullible and, all these things. And it's like, no. First of all, people are still being executed for witchcraft today. Second of all, these were people who were the same as us. They have the same fears and worries. They fell in love. They had relationships. They felt jealousy. They felt excitement. These are humans with human emotions, and the tendency to scapegoat that they experienced then, we do today, frequently with other words substituted in. Instead of saying witch, we say, terrorist. Instead of saying, witch, we say, whatever. It's something that you see happening again and again and again, and it's not going to stop, until we really shine a light on it.
One angle I think that people use to sort of minimize somewhat what happened, particularly in Salem, which I think has been debunked, but I want to just talk about this briefly, is people saying that it was caused by ergot poisoning, and that there was, I think it was a bacteria that in the bread and the grain that then caused people to basically go bonkers, and that's what it was. But I think that's been pretty roundly debunked now, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. So the ergot theory is something that haunts us here in Salem in perpetuity, I think, for the rest of time. But essentially, this was a theory put forward in the 1970s, actually by an undergraduate student who was a science major writing a history paper. And she basically speculated perhaps the affliction was caused by ergot poisoning. So ergot is a fungus that grows on rye or wheat. And when you ingest it, you experience basically a psychotropic effect. So it's almost like if you took LSD, you'll have hallucinations, you'll see things. You'll also become very, very sick. It really messes with your stomach and your digestion. It poisons you essentially. So she had speculated maybe that's why the afflictions began and spread. And that theory was debunked immediately by historians. So within a year, historians of the Salem Witch Trials had come out and said, this doesn't make sense if we apply it to what actually happened, though, because if it was ergot, it wouldn't be just one or two people in a house. Everybody would be eating the same bread. It's not like you'd see one person come down with the illness. Again, everybody's eating the same bread. You also see more and more people becoming afflicted over a larger geographic area. So the affliction starts in Salem, but then by the time we get to the summer, it's in Andover, which today is a 40-minute drive away. So you see a specific group of people in Andover pop up with an affliction. That doesn't really make sense. And then you also, as we get to the summer, see people being able to turn the affliction on and turn it off. So people who are becoming afflicted when it's convenient and then going about the rest of their day and they're fine. And that's where we start to see fraud come into the story, where you can definitely see some people accusing people of witchcraft for personal gain or for whatever, because of peer pressure or whatever the reason. But you see that clear fraud. So despite the fact, though, that this theory was debunked pretty conclusively by the historical community, it has really latched on in public memory. And you see it even today purported as fact. You'll hear documentaries that are supposed to be historical documentaries saying it's the ergot theory, this is why it happened. You'll see websites and things like that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, I'm sad to say, even you hear it on tours in Salem, some of the, walking tours, not most of them, but, it kind of slips its way in. And it's because it's such an easy explanation. It would be so great if it's just this clean, easy medical explanation, nothing more dark or insidious here. It's just people got sick and they were silly Puritans who didn't understand medicine, and that's why things spiral out of control. And that's unfortunately very much not the case. It doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, it would be lovely and very comforting if we could just use those sorts of excuses for effectively excusing what human behaviour does, but thoroughly debunked. Rachel, we could listen to you for hours and hours, and it's Zoe's and I. Zoe, we're going to travel the world, aren't we?
When we get so much. Traveling world.
And we are definitely going to come to the museum and take part in it. We'd absolutely love to do that. So we really do hope one day we get to meet you in person, perhaps when we're not all masked up. But thank you so very much for coming to speak to us today. We very much appreciate it, taking time out from the work you do with students. And I think it's so amazing that in the education system in America, there allows some opportunity to find out about these sorts of things, because as Zoe and I have spoken about at length, the Scottish system does not teach us our own history. So some people are finding out through our podcasts. I mean, we are finding out through our podcast about the number of people that were involved and, the areas that were affected. But it's so good that at least some schools in America have the opportunity to get to hear from you, because you've got a really, really important story to tell. So thank you so much for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you. This has been so interesting for me. It's funny, Jill, our assistant education director, and I have been saying the same thing of when the pandemic's over, we're going to travel the world and go to all the places that we have an interest in. So someday, Scotland is 100% on the list, and maybe there'll be a memorial to visit by that time. So
I hope so. We definitely hope so. We look forward to meeting up with you and bringing you to the memorial.
So hopefully you'll be able to bring me to the memorial when I come. So
great. I look forward to it. Thank you so much on behalf of Zoe and myself and all the listeners for speaking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today for our 31st episode of the Witches of Scotland podcast. I think we can all agree that was absolutely fascinating. If you could please keep spreading the word and get people to join our Facebook page, join us on Twitter and on Instagram. Our numbers are growing all the time, which is brilliant because basically it just means that the more people know about it, the more likelihood we have of having a successful outcome to our 3-pronged campaign. So that's quite, do you like that, Claire? That's quite exciting. So it's good. So please keep telling about it. And if you are friends with people that don't know about it already, but you think this might be within their area of interest, then please do let them know what we're doing. We've got listeners from all over the world. We're always getting contacted by people, and it's just absolutely brilliant to see how much people are enjoying it and are moved by it and are learning about the story of our past. It's really, really great.
Yeah, please do get in contact with us. We love interacting with you and finding out more. It's very humbling. Sometimes people are contacting us, particularly from the US, that have done a lot of research on Scotland. And you just think that they are taking such time to put into research to uncover Scottish history. It's really, really quite humbling that they're able to tell you things in such detail. And also, I mean, I don't know about you, Zoe, but I now cannot wait to start to travel around a wee bit to some of the places that people have shown us and told us about.
I'm actually going proper stir crazy now. I have to say, I'm really struggling. I really like travel. It really is something that's a real core value of mine, is to travel. And I feel so depressed about the fact that I've been stuck in a very nice village in a very nice part of the world. It's beautiful. I really can't complain. I mean, I'm going to complain. I am complaining. But I just really miss airports. I miss going and paying too much for a cooked breakfast and then getting on a plane and being annoyed that the person next to me is breathing. And, I just really miss that. I just want to fly away.
I don't miss airports at all because I hate flying.
Oh God, I love airports. I love flying. I love it. I love it so much. I love being in the airport. Genuinely.
I will meet you there, but I will have taken a camper van and then several freight ships in my camper van, and I will see you there in about a fortnight. How's about that, Zoe?
Okay, that's fine. That'll be okay. I'll just make sure I've got plenty of books to read en route. I'll be happy. Anyway, sorry, bit of a ramble. But if you would come back and join us next week, we can promise you more of this top quality bants. So please do come back again. And please do, if you're not following us in any of those social media areas, then please do follow to keep up to date with what's going on. So Thanks very much and cheerio.
Bye.
Bye.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.